Thank you, everybody, for joining today. This is our latest conversation in our Equity Matters series. And today we're digging under the surface, looking at how racism continues to shape fraud narratives in public benefits. My name is Wendy Chun-Hoon. I'm Executive Director at CLASP, and I'm grateful to be with you today as we examine and really work to disrupt narratives that are villainizing public benefits recipients. CLASP's Public Benefits Justice team curated this amazing conversation to help us all understand exactly what is happening, why it matters, and also how we can come together to counter the harmful narratives that are once again being used to justify dangerous policies. The Trump administration's attacks on Somali childcare providers in Minnesota earlier this year really catalyzed allegations of fraud in childcare programs across the country, leading to and justifying funding freezes and additional requirements on states before they'd even be allowed to access pre-allocated resources. Then the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services used these accusations as a pretext to launch investigations into alleged discrepancies in state Medicaid programs. Then the White House created a task force on fraud that has a multi-agency strategy to stop waste, fraud, and abuse in federal benefits programs by pointing fingers at everyone, from state, local government officials to nonprofits to providers and to undocumented immigrants. Congress has now also taken action, introducing so-called anti-fraud bills, in fact, signaling a whole of government effort to sow distrust in our public basic needs programs and making them a lot harder to access. And we know that because of all the recent rules changes coming from last year's big reconciliation bill, which is fundamentally diminishing our public safety net, state administrators are being forced to shift budgets, to implement new performance metrics and costly new verification processes, and understand new databases in order to continue to receive funding from the federal government. So today we get to hear from leaders who are on the front lines of supporting and defending Black and Brown communities in this era when our civil and human rights are being compromised daily. Their experiences are rooted in community perspectives, in research and policy, and movement work, coalition building, and also importantly, narrative strategy, and are going to help guide us as we discuss how to flip the script for policymakers and the public to ensure that Black and Brown communities are no longer threatened and scapegoated. Before we get started, I want to share how CLASP is helping to disrupt this dangerous fraud narrative. Our public benefits justice team, our childcare and early education team, our immigration and immigrant family team have all been defending against the incessant attacks on the programs that are at the center of CLASP's work, from childcare to Medicaid to SNAP to housing policy. And we're directly pushing back on the administration's aggressive regulatory changes through coalition building and legislative advocacy. And we do this work in partnership through critical networks such as the Partnership for Basic Needs, the Childcare for Every Family Network, and also Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition. Finally, our public benefits justice team, who's hosting today's Equity Matters conversation, has been highlighting the racist roots of this false fraud narrative for several years now, and we'll all get to learn a little bit more about that today. Before we dive in, I want to take just a second to talk about how we're going to use the chat during today's conversation. We see the chat as part of our building community together and really as a space where we can reflect, we can affirm, connect with others who care about the issues. So a couple of quick guidelines to make sure that the space is going to work well for everyone. If you are a member of the media, we ask that you do not quote or report on what you hear here unless you've received permission from the speaker. We want to ensure that this space is open and the conversation can be as candid as possible. Second, again, please use the chat to share reflections, words of encouragement, and resources that you think others are going to find useful. Third, if you have a question for the speakers, we're going to use not the chat, but the Q&A box. And that way you can be sure your question is seen and lifted up. There are several hundred of you who are joining in this virtual room. And so we enabled the option to be able to upvote the questions so that they can be elevated to the top. So definitely take advantage of that option. And then finally, we want to maintain a respectful and welcoming space for everybody. So we ask that the comments you offer reflect that spirit. Okay, now we get started. We would love to know more about everybody who's joining. And so we're going to do a couple of quick polls. I think our first poll is coming up, should be popping up on your screen. And just take a minute to let us know more about who you are. Maybe we'll wait a few more seconds and then we'll close the poll and see who's with us. All right, Isha, should we close the poll and put it up? Yeah, there's a big range. That's great. So we can clearly see from the results, this is a really broad cross section of everybody from community organizers and researchers and government partners, lots of advocates, movement builders, also some philanthropic partners are joining. And that's really underscores why today's conversation is so necessary. Our diversity is really a testament to the multiracial democracy that we're fighting so hard to protect and to build together. And so it also gives us hope that collectively we can create more ways to move forward. Okay, we're going to do our second poll. We want to hear your initial thoughts about narratives around fraud, just as we begin this conversation. Okay, hopefully you've all been able to take that poll, and we'll close it in a couple of seconds and see where we are on this at the outset of our conversation. Okay. Yeah, lots of answers for number five, that it's embedded throughout policymakers' narratives. Thank you. And then this is going to be our third poll for now. We want to learn more about your perspectives on who we think is committing fraud. So Isha will launch that one. Maybe a few more seconds for everybody to answer. Okay, let's see what we think. Wow, a lot of diversity in our answers, which is really interesting and also underscores why it's so important that we're in this conversation. So thank you. All right, I'm about to hand it over, but I just want to reinforce sort of the central question for this conversation. And that is, how can we shift narratives and perspective around public benefits to make sure that we're not centering racism and xenophobia? In this conversation, we're going to move from divisive framing into solutions. We're going to discuss how we can all play a part in crafting a new story and ensuring that people who access public benefits are treated with respect and with dignity. And so with that, let's move into our discussion with our CLASP colleagues, Jesse Fairbanks and Tian Hayes from our Public Benefits Justice team.
Thank you so much. Yes, the slides are up. Good afternoon, beautiful people, and welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Tian Hayes, and I am a senior policy analyst on the PBJ team. So before we dive into today's discussion, we think it's very important to definitely spend a few moments level setting and examining the narratives that shape how many people understand public benefits in the first place. When we hear these claims about widespread fraud, waste, and abuse in public benefit programs, we are often presented with these ideas as objective facts. But narratives do not emerge in a vacuum. They are shaped by generations of beliefs, political choices, media portrayals, and critical and cultural assumptions. To understand today's fraud narrative, we have to understand the historical and the social context that tells us who deserves help, who does not deserve help, and why people experience poverty in the first place. Now, we do not spend too much time repeating the harmful and the unsupported narratives. In fact, one of our goals of today's conversation is to move beyond them. But it is so important that we briefly name what is being said so that we can better understand what is driving it. In recent years, and especially in recent months, we have heard a growing number of allegations that public benefit programs are riddled with fraud, that too many people are taking advantage of the system, that government assistance discourages work, and that stronger restrictions are needed to protect taxpayer dollars. So rather than spending our time debating these claims, we really want to focus on something deeper, the beliefs and the assumptions that make these narratives resonate in the first place. Because when we look beneath the surface, these arguments are often rooted in much older ideas about poverty, race, and deservingness. So the next slide we'll go to, we will talk about what is at the heart of these narratives and how these powerful beliefs deserve a closer examination. So on the next slide, we will talk about first the belief that people experiencing poverty are inherently undeserving. Throughout American history, public benefit policies has been shaped by this distinction between deserving and undeserving. These narratives have never been race neutral, and they can be traced back for decades. From the stereotypes of the 1970s welfare queen to the current day criminalization of assistance recipients, racist narrative have long portrayed Black communities and other communities of color as more likely to misuse public resources, despite evidence showing otherwise. Second, these narratives often treat poverty as a result of individual failure rather than systemic inequities. Factors such as racial disparities, stagnant wages, rising costs of living, unequal access, all of these things shape economic mobility far more than individual choices. When we ignore these structural realities, we create space for narratives that blame individuals for circumstances that are more often than not caused by or produced by systems. In addition, many fraud narratives are built on the assumption that people who can work simply choose not to. The reality, let's be clear on it, that the majority of adults who receive public benefits are able to work, either are working, have caregiving responsibilities, or they face significant barriers to employment. Yet, public arguments often reduce these complex barriers to a simplistic narrative that people are avoiding to work. And lastly, there is this belief that outsiders will consume the finite number of resources. This narrative is rooted in the efforts to divide communities and instill fear and distrust of immigrants, especially immigrants of color. Throughout history, we have seen unjust immigration policies have been justified by these false claims that immigrants are threatening jobs or draining public resources. Once again, we want to be clear that immigrant communities enrich American culture, they strengthen our communities, and they contribute significantly to our economy, all while being excluded from many basic need programs. So rather than allowing this scarcity and fear to divide us, we have to focus on building systems that ensure everyone has the resources they need to thrive. Folks, these beliefs are not just talking points. They are the mental models that shape public opinion, policy design, and administrative practices. They influence who we trust, who we surveil, who we punish, and who we support. So that is why today's conversation is so important. Narrative change cannot be separate from policy change. Narrative change is the bedrock of radical change. So next, I will turn it over to my lovely colleague, Jesse Fairbanks, who is going to walk us through developing counter arguments that challenges these harmful narratives, and most importantly, it pulls them from the root. Jesse, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tian. I'm Jesse Fairbanks. I'm a policy analyst on the Benefits Justice team as well. And again, thank you for articulating what this conservative narrative around fraud and public benefits is, Tian, and clarifying why it still has so much political power. Policymakers have relied on this narrative for decades now, and the roots underneath this tree run very deep. So I want to talk to you guys today about how we can potentially counter it. At CLASP, we have been leaning on some core arguments to weaken and shift this dominant narrative. Developing arguments that counter harmful and dominant narratives requires us to treat the soil that nourishes American culture. Then we can begin to break down the individualist, the racist, and the nativist roots that are keeping conservative portrayals of fraud and public benefits alive and strong. I love a metaphor. Gardeners depend on a few different techniques to improve soil quality, and one of them, with roots in indigenous cultures, involves growing complementary crops that minimally compete for resources, and this is called intercropping. And when done correctly, this practice can replenish the soil and encourage new growth. So our goal is to popularize a narrative around, quote, fraud and public benefits that redefines that term as an act committed by people with the institutional power to actually abuse government resources, a narrative that asserts the humanity and deservingness of benefit recipients, and finally, a narrative that refocuses America's cultural priority on meeting people's basic needs. So we'll need to mix and match crops that appeal to different audiences to achieve that goal. But in whatever garden we're planning to cultivate, we can't forget to plant the crops that are foundational to challenging this dominant narrative at its roots, to challenging those individualist, racist, and nativist roots. You can go to the next slide, Isha. So let's get into a few talking points. This first category challenges the belief that recipient level fraud in basic needs programs is a relevant issue entirely. First, we do that by truth telling. So policymakers constructed this lie to sow public distrust in programs. They scapegoat Black and immigrant communities to justify policy changes that hurt all eligible people, including the middle class in times of financial emergency. And using billions of dollars to surveil benefit recipients won't make groceries, housing, and gas affordable for everyday people. Then we can move on to present an alternative worldview. Instead of putting resources behind harmful and expensive proposals, the government could be investing tax dollars into public goods and services that help people afford their basic needs and actually get a leg up financially. We could live in a country where every person has a stable home, food, and healthcare. The next slide. This next set of talking points narrows the public's definition of fraud. So the dominant narrative that currently exists depends a lot on an ambiguous definition that does incriminate people experiencing poverty, or at least leaves the space to incriminate people experiencing poverty. So we see a lot of power in first clearly defining fraud. Fraud is the act of obtaining something valuable through willful misrepresentation, and it's committed by people with the institutional power to actually abuse government resources. People who have significant influence over governments, over corporations, and legal systems are more likely to be perpetrators of fraud. Can follow that up with clear examples of actual fraud. Nearly 1,000 millionaires have not filed their tax returns and owe an estimated 34 billion in taxes. Healthcare companies commit millions in fraud through schemes like upcoding every year. And finally, we can clarify what the real relationship between fraud and public benefits is. Fraud and wealth hoarding lead to an underfunded system that can't serve everybody who's eligible. Wealthy people and corporations who avoid paying their taxes withhold critical revenue from our schools, from our libraries, and from core basic needs programs like Medicaid. Next slide. And this is our last set of talking points. These talking points undermine depictions of people with low incomes as villainous, as the enemy, and they instead assert their humanity. Honest mistakes happen. These programs can be challenging to navigate because of complicated rules and excessive paperwork. In fact, so much documentation is required that eligible people are often deterred from applying. Just imagine going to the DMV every 6 months to renew your license. It sounds like a headache and nobody wants to do that. I know the amount of times I've been turned back is embarrassing. Because these processes are so burdensome, people can unintentionally make mistakes. So adding more steps to the already complicated process causes real harm. It may deter eligible people from applying or even lead to an increase in improper denials as state workers struggle to implement new rules. We found that these talking points also help us segue into solutions that could improve basic needs programs. If the goal is to ultimately prevent application errors, policymakers should streamline programs by aligning eligibility criteria or eliminating the interview process. So those are the talking points that I wanted to go over with you all today. It is always a work in progress, so I definitely encourage you guys after this webinar, if you have ideas too of arguments that have been salient in your conversations, we would love to hear them. So thank you so much for your time. We're going to be sending out some follow-up materials too, including these slides. And now I get to pass it over to my colleague and friend, Parker Gilkison Davis, who's going to moderate our panel today.
Thank you, Jesse and Tian. Hello, everyone. So again, my name is Parker Gilkison Davis, and I am a senior policy analyst on the PBJ team as well. So earlier, you just heard Jesse and Tian help us understand how narratives about fraud and public benefits have evolved over time, how they're rooted in racism and stereotypes, and also how they continue to shape policy discussions today. So, throughout my career, I have worked to examine and expose the ways systemic racism shapes policy, particularly in programs intended to support people with low incomes. I've had the opportunity to testify before Congress on these issues, conduct research, work alongside directly impacted communities, and help elevate stories that too often go unheard. Again and again, I have seen how narratives about fraud are not simply about program integrity. They are a part of a much longer history of portraying Black people, immigrants, and other communities of color as undeserving, irresponsible, or suspicious in order to justify exclusion, surveillance, and cuts to critical supports. What often gets left out of these conversations is that the need for public benefits did not appear out of thin air. Many of the barriers families face today are the direct result of policies and systems that have marginalized communities for generations, from segregation and redlining to exclusionary immigration policies and unequal access to education, employment, and wealth building opportunities. These systems have created a cycle where the same communities harmed by inequitable policies are then blamed for needing support. While fraud is often discussed as a matter of program integrity, we know the untrue narratives about fraud have real consequences. They shape public opinion, influence policy decisions, and ultimately affect whether families can access the resources they need to survive and thrive. But if there's one thing I have learned about this work, it is that narratives can be changed. The stories we inherit are not the stories we have to keep telling. Today is an opportunity to move beyond myths and misconceptions and toward a more honest conversation about who public benefits are for, why they matter, and what it will take to build systems rooted in dignity, trust, and humanity. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by an incredible group of leaders who each bring unique perspectives on how these false narratives show up in communities, impact policies, and what it will take to build a different story moving forward. So I would love for our panelists to come on and introduce themselves. And while they're introducing themselves, please share their perspective on why are the White House and federal and state legislators talking about fraud now? What is unique about this time and the fraud narrative? And we'll start with Adriana.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. My name is Adriana Cadena. I am the Executive Director of the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition. I'm an immigrant from Mexico. I've been in the US for over 40 years. So this is my home, and I've also legalized with the 1986 amnesty law. So really appreciate the work that happened in order for people like us to be here. Throughout our country's history, the anti-immigrant sentiment has been used to exclude people of color and people who are poor. And there have been countless systemic attempts to falsely link immigrants to the abuse of welfare by using the fraud narrative, as we learned earlier today. And what is really unique about this moment is that the fraud narrative is being weaponized to justify restrictive immigration policies, like today's Supreme Court decision that allows the Trump administration to turn away asylum seekers at the border. Also used to conduct mass deportation efforts and to exclude mixed status immigrant families from access to public benefits. Benefits that they also pay for with their own tax dollars. So the moment today is really critical for us to engage in this conversation and in this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. I'll pass it on to Christina.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Hassan. I am super nervous, so my voice just went out right then. It is so many people here, and I'm so honored to be here. I am a community advocate here in Philadelphia, born and raised, based here, raising my family here. I speak from the positionality of advocate, but also a person with lived experience. Um, I am also an alumni of the community partnership group with CLASP. Um, and I want to talk a little bit about why now. Why this is coming up now is because there are a lot of pressures to figure out our economy. It's in shambles. I think we all recognize this. We all know this. And there has to be a scapegoat. There always is. And a lot of the times that scapegoat is Black and brown community members. For one reason or another, there's a ease that comes with governments to be able to criminalize and villainize Black and brown people. And right now they're doing it through the fraud narrative. I think that one of the biggest things that Jesse sort of kind of touched on was that fraud, in its definition, is intentional deception. That is not what we see in communities. That is not what people living every day to take care of their families are doing at all. However, that is a word that is strategically being used right now to criminalize and villainize and dehumanize people. Because once they're dehumanized, it feels okay to make any assumption about them, to allow for people to be able to sleep at night to do whatever they want to do to them. I think that these talking points are really convenient right now as we are struggling to find resources to spread throughout our country. And I think that one of the things that Jesse also touched on is that the reason why the struggle is here is because people at the top, the billionaires, the trillionaires, refuse to pay what they need to pay. And they're not looked at as fraudulent and they're not looked at as criminals. A lot of the times they're overlooked and pointing the finger at people who are simply trying to make a way and simply trying to make ends meet. I think that after we have come through such a hard time where all of us were trying to figure out how we're going to survive a global pandemic, we're now fighting a new enemy. And I think that the enemy is the criminalization of people's skin tone under a different guise. And people are constantly overlooking the fact that there is a certain face to this narrative. And so I think that during this conversation, we're definitely going to be able to connect and be able to rewrite these narratives so that we can not only protect the people that need protection, but also bring them to the forefront of the solutions for this harmful rhetoric.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, I will pass it next on to Evie.
Hello, hello. And I too can get very, very nervous in these conversations, but I also want to thank everyone for not only being in this space, but as was raised earlier, for really contemplating where we go now when the Supreme Court has made some some even more drastic challenges to humanity across various communities that I think are unified in many ways by this conversation. My name is Ifeoma Ike. Everyone calls me Iffy. I'm an attorney, I'm a researcher, and I'm also a founder of a strategy consulting space called Pink Cornrows, where I identify as a chief equity weaver. I like to say if data and facts were enough, then we would be free by now. But we know that the things that are holding us back are really around how foundational narratives have cemented a permanent underclass and a permanent criminalization of communities that are living in systems that were designed for them, not by them. We just celebrated the birthday of Octavia Butler, who is one of my favorite Afrofuturists. And she reminds us that discussing the problems of systems and speculating on what that means for humanity is not a practice of doom, but it is actually a form of harm reduction. So I like to see the space of narratives as being alongside movement work, legal work, policy work, community work, as a tool for how we bring folks along to see the damage of the original design that we have all inherited, but also to be in dreaming spaces where we can dream the futures that we deserve, the todays that we deserve, but also that we are clear on not replicating that harm. And sometimes that also leads to uncomfortable conversations about how even communities who are in marginalized spaces can knowingly and unknowingly also replicate certain forms of either anti-Blackness, xenophobia, ableism, and how that is also preventing all of us from moving forward. I'll conclude by saying that I love that there's a comrade here from Philly. I grew up in Trenton, and so as a lawyer, I've seen these narratives codified into policy, right? And as a strategist, I've also seen them weaponized in public discourse. But I also moved through this conversation as a Black woman in America who is disabled, who comes from an immigrant home, and also comes from a community that was designed to be poor, right? That many of us are also living with the embodiment of this injustice. And so, really, as we talk about fraud narratives and public benefits, I also just want us to root the fact that many of us are experiencing the consequences in our bodies as it relates to narratives that were created about us, and that we're not just talking about a messaging problem, we are talking about a power problem. So at the root of all this, yes, it's about how we change narrative, and I don't want that to be separate from how we build power, because at the end of the day, those who are in power are also the ones writing the laws and determining who's human or not. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Iffy. And we'll pass it on to Dr. Mishner.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see or just how many of you are in this Zoom room, and there's a lot of things that one could be doing on a weekday afternoon, and it's heartening to see how many people want to be here thinking about and talking about these pretty intense topics. But I think that things that we have to engage and we have to really think through together and deepen our understanding of. So super excited to be here with all of you right now, honestly, having this conversation. So I'm Jamila Michener. I'm a professor at Cornell. I'm a professor of government and public policy. And from my perch as a researcher, I study poverty and racial inequality and think a lot about programs like Medicaid and other social policy programs and beyond, and think a lot about how people experience being on these programs, relying on the government to be able to survive, and sometimes usually less times to thrive. And I not only think about how programs like Medicaid affect people's material life, I also think about how they affect people's political lives, their standing in our democracy. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how people at the economic and racial margins can actually also affect the systems and the structures that are structuring their life, right? So really this, and I love what Ify just said about power, this notion that the folks that are being stigmatized by these narratives of fraud are not just victims, but they're actually active agents. And they have not just voices, but they can have and exercise power, right? And so a lot of my work really thinks about those relationships between government policies, processes, and institutions, people's experiences, material and political, and people's power and their ability to affect and change the systems that they're embedded in. I appreciate this question that we've been given to sort of start with around, well, what's new and different about now? Why are these fraud narratives being activated now in a way that feels distinct? And on the one hand, my impetus to answering that question is to say, there's very little that's new about this, in the sense that we can look back as far as before the quote unquote founding of this country, before there was a United States of America, when we were, I like to say this and some people don't like it, but when we were just some ragtag colonies, right? At the sort of very beginnings of the settler colonial origins that created the US. There were narratives during that time about fraud before there was really anything that even resembled a welfare state, right? We didn't even have much that the state, the government could offer people. And there were still concerns about fraud, right? And there were still narratives about deservingness. Who deserves to be a part of this particular community or this particular polity? In sort of early colonial communities, a lot of these narratives, even then, were about being able to create bases for exclusion, right? So the indigenous people whose lands were being stolen and encroached upon, you know, the idea that they didn't deserve whatever resources we're generating on these lands. And who gets to be a part of a community and who is outside of it. The people that we deem undeserving, they're outside of the community. That gives us a basis, a reason for excluding them, a reason for hoarding resources that can benefit us and our communities, but not the others. And often, historically in this country, the other has been a racial other and has been an other that has either been, you know, from another place, right? In very early colonial communities, there were doctors that offered pro bono health services, but you had to be from the community. And who wasn't from the community by default? Well, enslaved people weren't from the community. Immigrants who didn't have a history of living in that place weren't from the community. Indigenous people weren't from the community. And so there is this long history of identifying racial and economic outsiders and deeming them undeserving of benefits and creating narratives and logics that justified their exclusion. And what we're seeing now is another iteration of that. It's a new iteration of that. It takes different forms because we're in a different time, but there are threads of continuity that are worth keeping in mind. Some of the things that I think are new about the moment that we're in is that we're in a context where not only the kind of current federal administration, but the very milieu we're in a context where it's it's more comfortable for people, it's more accepted, and it's more encouraged to really lean into these narratives, to not think about their differential effects on different populations, right? So you don't have to grapple with the fact that work reporting requirements or intensive and often fruitless efforts to root out fraud, quote unquote, largely non-existent fraud, or at least fraud that we're not identifying in the right places. Um, you don't have to acknowledge that that is going to disproportionately harm Black and Latine and Native and other populations of color. And in fact, when somebody brings that up, when somebody says that, we now have an easy thing. We can call that DEI. We can call that woke. We can call that all of these different things that often we don't think carefully about what they mean. By we, I don't necessarily mean us in the room, but I'm talking about the political milieu we're in. And we can disregard those legitimate concerns, criticisms, and analyses in a way that we couldn't even 5 years ago, right? And so we are in a moment where it's harder to be critical and to grapple with and to hold folks accountable for the racialized harms of these fraud narratives and the actions that they correspond to and that they are justifying. And the last thing I'll say is that we're also in a moment where there is a real effort to, in a sense, and I just want to be really direct about this, to redistribute resources upwards. Now, upward redistribution is something that has also been a part of the US political economy for a long time. But it is happening now in a way that is blatant and in a way that is subsidized and sponsored by the state. I think it more acutely than we have seen before, and honestly, more flagrantly. And so the upward redistribution, taking from those who have less to redistribute and give that to people who already have a lot, who have more, making billionaires trillionaires, making millionaires billionaires, making millionaires multimillionaires, and making people who are wealthy more wealthy. And that's what our tax code is doing, and that's what a lot of our policy is doing. And in order to facilitate that redistribution, you got to take these resources from one place and send them to another. And so, in that process, you need a way of justifying that. You need a way of making people feel good about political actions that are fundamentally wrong, antithetical to democracy, antithetical to a fair and humane economy. How do you do that? You do that by finding folks to demonize and by wrapping your fundamentally unfair and unequal actions in a package that is consistent with what we've seen in American political culture, which is a kind of real, almost obsession with deservingness, and a long-standing stigmatization of people in need. So I do think there are some things that are different now, but I also think there are these deep continuities that we should keep in mind and that we should grapple with as we go.
Wow. Thank you for those introductions. My goodness, if that's how we're getting started, imagine how we're going to finish. Okay. So I want to transition us over to Christina. So one of the things we've talked about is how fraud narratives often feel disconnected from what people are actually experiencing in their everyday lives. So through both your lived experience and your community work in Philly, how have you seen these narratives show up in your community and affect individuals and families who are trying to access public benefits? And what do you wish people understood about the realities behind them?
Thank you, Parker. Normally, I never read off paper, but I want to make sure that I get this correct and get my point completely across. Um, so, throughout my work here in Philadelphia and throughout Pennsylvania, the conversations that I've had with community members have enlightened me to understand that these fraud narratives have created a sense of increased shame, fear, and stigma that people who are simply needing help throughout their journey are feeling deeply. These narratives are deterring them from being able to seek the simple help that they need. Um, some people have become fearful to even apply for benefits that they most likely will qualify for, because the system has pushed them to the outskirts and othered them. I wish that people understood that most of the people receiving benefits are people just like you and I. There are people that fall on hard times. There are people that, despite their circumstances, are amazing. They are willing to do what they need to do to take care of themselves, but simply need assistance. They're in circumstances that most likely are not due to anything caused by them. They're simply trying to pay their rent, buy groceries, keep the lights on, and take care of their family, often managing their own disabilities or the disabilities of others around them. The reality is that most of these people are doing the best that they can and trying to survive a system that is constantly made more difficult for them to navigate. The fraud narrative often ignores the everyday realities of the people experiencing these systems and being harmed by them. I actually had a conversation with a few people around this narrative and how it affects them. And I want to give you guys direct quotes from these conversations. I really want to share what people are experiencing because I don't think that we talk enough about the mental load that this stigma and this fear and this shame is putting onto families that often results in psychological trauma that we don't acknowledge that the system is putting onto these communities. So speaking with people, I will quote them saying that it is embarrassing. The system does not work for us. There are many discrepancies where the benefits are offered, there is a lot of dehumanization. In this conversation, I spoke with someone who has two autistic children and was talking about the renewal of benefits. As Jesse mentioned, this every 6 month renewal torture that we could imagine at the DMV is what families are facing every day just to have their basic needs met. The biggest thing that I spoke with this person about in this conversation was insurance. The insurance is needed by people that have disabilities, right? It's needed by everyday people. When I'm having conversation with my colleagues, one of our best benefits is our insurance. And I think that oftentimes when we talk about fraud or where these narratives are being spent, it's often being spent in the form of these people are lazy, they don't want to, they refuse to. And the sad reality is that some people are born different and they need different things. We are all actually born very unique and very different. And I think for people that, like myself, that are able to have a son with ADHD and I'm able to get a degree and work two jobs and, really fight the system tooth and nail, I'm able to now be in a situation where my son with ADHD is able to receive alternative resources. However, if I had been in a situation where my son could not walk, could not talk, I could not get up, or I was in pain, right? Excruciating pain doing the things that I'm doing, I don't know if I would be able to. And for us to, or for people to look at human beings and look down on them and have them feeling like their life isn't worth it, right? Have them feeling like this struggle, this fight isn't really worth it, is something that I think is often overlooked. And so as much as these narratives are harmful, I think that they're really killing people from the inside out. I think that they're really destroying communities. I really think that they're destroying the hope of the American dream that these people are often talking about. I think that it is not only deterring and like saddening people, but it's really crushing people's ability to see where they fit in a system in a country that's supposed to be made for everybody. Um, I I often feel that when people with lived experience are left out of these conversations, these systems are left to like thrive and continue to harm and continue to like repeat on itself. There are plenty of people that within my family would not know half of the resources or half of the advocacy tools that are out there had I not had the ability to be able to receive the resources and connections that I have. They're trying their best, and oftentimes they are insulted with these allegations and discouraged, to be honest. And I think that it's one of those things where there's so much energy being put into harming and hurting people and spinning false narratives that could really be put into advocating and making these systems better and giving people assistance on how to navigate these systems. They are tricky. When I'm talking about the wording is tricky, the phone interviews are tricky, the language is tricky, right? It's not common everyday language. And I want to double back a little bit to the point I made before about fraud is intentional deception. The amount of resources, and this is where I think getting in the nitty gritty really is beneficial. The amount of resources, whether it be food stamps or SSI, is not millions and billions of dollars that people are receiving to intentionally deceive. Right? We're talking about hundreds of dollars that is closing a gap to help someone get by. And so we have to really begin to look at the why, right? The why would somebody say that there's widespread fraud, right? Why would somebody have people believing that for a couple $100 people will intentionally not only put their own lives on the line but put their family lives on the line? And it's only because if that narrative benefits them, that narrative criminalizes and dehumanizes people that are at the bottom, that are rendered voiceless. They don't have a seat at the table and they're not able to come into spaces and really share what they're going through. And so I hope that you all, and I know that you all understand that it's all a farce. It's all fake. And it's ultimately harmful to people that really do want to try and get one foot in front of the other every day to provide for themselves and the families around them.
Thank you so much for that, Christina. I really feel like you grounded us and what these conversations look like in community. So moving on to Dr. Mishner, I'd love to build on that because I know your research helps us understand why some of these narratives persist despite evidence to the contrary. So your research examines the relationship between public policy, poverty, racial inequality, and democratic participation. Tian and Jesse shared earlier why narratives about fraud have been so persistent in conversations about public benefits, despite evidence that clearly shows widespread recipient fraud is relatively rare. So my question for you is, what are the broader consequences of policies being built around suspicion rather than trust? And how does that shape people's relationship with government and democracy itself?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Parker. And I think that there are so many themes that we'll see emerging in this conversation that I'm excited to see those insights, come through. And one of the themes that I hope that we'll see emerge and that I suspect we will is the real implications of these narratives for like democracy and for people's ability to exercise power within our democracy and really the imperative of that. I think part of what these narratives point to is the imperative of a kind of deep redistribution of power, and narratives are a part of that. And we might not always connect, social benefits like Medicaid or SNAP or WIC or what have you to democracy or to power. When I first started doing research on how Medicaid shapes people's experiences with democracy and their place in the polity, people would be like, oh, no, 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 you're politicizing Medicaid. That's not what it's about. And I would always say, like, these programs are fundamentally political because they involve resources, who gets them, who deserves them, and because they involve questions about who is included and excluded, and how should we treat one another? Who should we be with one another? And underlying that is this insight that people's experiences in the context of social programs send messages to them. Then people are learning lessons about who they are in the eyes of the government, in the eyes of society, about how they can be treated, about what their worth and value is, and about whether and how their voice matters, about whether they really have a place in this country, in this polity. And so often, the way that we design our policies and our programs and the narratives that surround that are telling people that they don't have a place, are telling people that they don't belong, are generating like frustration for them and are generating a sense of a lack of belonging and a lack of a desire to want to even engage the very structures that are affecting their lives. And that can be demobilizing, it can be disempowering, and ultimately it undermines our democracy, right? Because these things, these narratives are targeting the people at the margins, at the economic and racial margins. Those are the people who are made to feel bad. Those are the people who are made to feel less than. And those are the people who are then alienated from our systems, from our benefit agencies, from our government, and who their risk is who will not engage, who will not show up, not just at the voting polls, that's one thing, but in their communities in ways that they otherwise might, right? And so that's a real risk. But I want to say that it's not an inevitability. It isn't. We can make different choices. We can design policies in ways that include people, that reinforce their sense of belonging, their sense of worth, their sense of value, and even that help to build their power, that connect them to community institutions or to kind of collective mobilizations that are going to enable them to be a part of strengthening the programs that they're a part of and ultimately strengthening democracy. So I want to say that the problem is real, but the possibilities for doing something very different, something that opens up a whole new horizon, those are also real as well. And I want us to be thinking about both. And I want to end not with my words, but along the same vein that Christina suggested, because I think this is really important, with some thoughts from some people, me and some of my research team, we've been doing focus groups with people who have Medicaid over the last 8 months or so. And in these focus groups, we've been asking people about what they think about these policies that were passed in the in HR1, the one quote unquote big beautiful bill, and what they know about them, but then also once we explain what the policies are, what they think about them, what their reaction is. And a lot of what's been coming up in the conversations is fraud. And people have been telling us exactly what they think about fraud. And this is one thing that underscores this fact. People's experiences with government programs and the narrative and discourse around those experiences, they are picking up exactly what is being put down. And they are contrasting that with their experiences, and they are seeing that the two do not match. And they're making sense of that one way or another. And so we have to think about what that means for how people are positioned in our society and in our politics, right? So one person in one of our focus groups, a guy named Kurt, said the biggest frustration for me is this whole picture that keeps being painted by the administration about Medicaid fraud and that so many people are stealing from Medicaid. This drives me crazy because when you're on Medicaid, you know this. The process to certify and recertify, it's like jumping through hoops 10 times over. You have to have tons of paperwork and tons of documentation to prove who you are and what you have and what you don't have and so forth. And so then I watch the news or I read social media and it's like, oh, people are stealing from the government through Medicaid. And I'm just like, that's almost impossible, right? So this is the disjuncture between what people are hearing and what they know to be true based on their experience. That's what they're struggling to make sense of, right? I just want to read one more because, or two more because they're short and they're really important. A woman we talked to named Talia said, I think that bill, they said it was about fraud, but I think that big, beautiful bill was more about, I'm just going to say it. I think it was about racism, right? And in the same conversation, a woman named Laura really deepens this analysis. And she says, there's just such a low percentage of fraud that actually exists. And nobody dismantles the stock market because of insider trading. So why would you dismantle Medicaid because of fraud? And then she says it's blatant racism. We're only 14% of the population in this country, but some kind of way people still assume that we're the biggest population on welfare, and it's just not true. Now, I could read you 10 more of these. I won't because we don't have that time and I'm going to wrap up. But the point is to say people know exactly what is up. People are smart. People are savvy. And the last thing I'll say is at the end of these focus groups, we ask people, what do you think? Is there anything you can do about this? Is there anything you can do to change this? And almost always people said, not really. And so I think that points to the work that is to be done here is crafting narratives that help people to see their role in these processes, that when they work collectively, when they are organized, when they are strategic and focused, and they actually participate in ways that are pushing back against the things that they know are wrong, they can do something about it. And so those are the narratives I think that are promising that we need to be thinking about how to cultivate, how to build.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Mishner. I think your work really reminds us that these narratives just don't just influence public opinion, but they also influence who feels welcome, who feels seen, and who feels safe interacting with public institutions. So I'm going to shift over to Adriana. Immigrant families have often found themselves at the center of these conversations, particularly as narratives around deservingness, fraud, and public charge have evolved over time. Immigrant families often face additional barriers to health, food, and other basic needs programs, in addition to eligibility exclusions like those included in HR 1 and deterrent immigration policies like public charge. The Trump administration and its allies in Congress and some state houses have targeted immigrant families in a new war on fraud. How is the current narrative around fraud targeting immigrant communities?
Wow, that's a lot, a long question. And I also just want to thank Dr. Michener and Christina, who spoke earlier. And I think what's really critical and important that I've learned from you all, and it's reiterated, is that we need to ensure we're including communities in this conversation. People are smart. People know what's going on. And how do we galvanize that power of our people to make sure that we change the systems that are hurting them? Is just, just tremendous in terms of what you shared. And also, Parker, thanks for highlighting the connection between eligibility restrictions like those in HR 1 and the deterrence policies like public charge within the broader fraud narrative. We know that the White House and its allies in Congress have used fraud as cover to shepherd HR 1 into law. And, it's one of the largest roadblocks in public benefits in years. And it just as was shared earlier, people know this. They know that. They hear that and they know like what is the real intention of this bill. Many, because of HR 1, many lawfully present immigrants have lost access to food assistance, health insurance, and other public benefits they previously had. Again, they previously had, and now they've been cut off. Meanwhile, we expect the Trump administration's new public charge rule as early as this week. And this, which is really this new proposed rule, is intended to scare and deter those who are lawfully present immigrants and those in mixed status families from accessing any benefit programs they are eligible for. And so both of these policies are being rationalized by fear mongering about immigrants and fraud. So, we know that policymakers, from the White House to the state houses, are making these connections, right? And that argument is a central element that they have for their midterm election strategy. So we know it's not going to go away anytime soon. And also, as been previously mentioned, it's not new. It's the same old narrative that we saw from the 80s in the Reagan era with the welfare queen narrative. And intentionally, what we see is that there's basically the three main points here that they're getting at. One is that Black and Brown people are stealing from the average American. Who gets to define who the average American is? We know, like, and we feel that. And the second is that ex-politician is standing up for that average American by cracking down on criminals, on these people that are taken away from everybody else. And then the third is that voting for the ex-politician in November is the best way you can protect your family. So pitting communities against each other. And so when we look at this, when you look at this in a way that, a few important things for us become clear. One, and I'm just reiterating what folks have already said, is that it's not about fraud. It's about race and it's about poverty. It's about people who have the least. So it's no accident that the administration's war on fraud is targeting and has targeted Somali families, for instance. And that, it's the people who are hurting and who need benefits who are being scapegoated. And it's not about good government or program integrity. It's about politics and it's about control and it's about where they really want to put all these resources that the government has. And it's actually, in this message is not for progressives or really even for moderates. It's aimed at turning out MAGA base voters. And why? Because the administration is in trouble. Their mass deportation message created after the atrocities in Minneapolis, its war on Iran is largely seen as a failure, and a persistently high cost of living undercuts the Trump's, campaign promises that he made. So this fraud narrative is desperately attempting to change the subject to something that will turn out MAGA voters to keep the current government in power. And the other thing I think it's important to note and is also that the polling is on our side. The research by our friends at the Partnership for Basic Needs, PBN, finds that American people really value health and social services programs and that everyone should have access to them. And we at PIF did some polling that showed that 83% of American people think the lawfully present immigrants should get access to the safety net, to these programs that they need. The PBN also showed two important things about the administration's fraud on attack. One is that we can't ignore it. So we have to address this head on. Because if voters believe that there is fraud in basic needs, they're not going to believe us if only simply we say that it's not. We really have to address this. And the second is that, I think it was demonstrated earlier is that we can tell the truth. We can be honest about this. Voters think that corporations are the real fraudsters. And so that they're gaming safety net programs to pad their profits. And that is absolutely right. And it's true. And so we need to demonstrate this as part of our messages. So, with that context in mind, we at PEF are really sharing out three main points that are important for us as we address this issue. One is that we should consider the source. Where is this information coming from? Trump and allies have really been caught lying repeatedly over and over, especially when it comes to immigrants and who immigrants are in this country and the contributions of immigrants to the U.S. The second is that companies are the real fraudsters. Just in 2023 alone, federal officials secured nearly 400 Medicaid fraud convictions. And in every single one of those cases, the perpetrator was a business. It wasn't an individual. It wasn't a family trying to make ends meet. And the other that for us is important to put to keep as a key point is that immigrants are our neighbors. There are people we know. There are people in our families, and they make our country stronger. So our approach in how we are dealing with this really does three things. One, it leans into the American people's low level of trust in the federal government under the Trump administration. Second, it aligns voters' beliefs that safety net fraud is real and corporations are the perpetrators. And it challenges policymakers to center corporate criminals in any real reform effort that they may take on. And it aligns with polling that finds that immigrants are good for America. Over and over, people are saying immigrants are good for America. Immigrants are part of our communities, and we need to be inclusive of immigrant communities and immigrant families in our country. So, I think the other I'll share is that it's important to note that we are focused here in our messaging. We are focused on moderates and especially on progressives. All the polling shows that they're more likely to be with us on all these 3 points: that Trump cannot be trusted, that corporations are the bad guys, and that immigrants make America better. So for us, this means that we're not trying to persuade J.D. Vance or Dr. Oz or Ron Johnson that they're wrong about immigrants and fraud. We're just trying to give progressive and moderates, people who are on the call here today, the backing that they need, so that it's not just the Vances and the Johnsons aren't the only ones talking about this issue. that we are talking about this issue and that we're talking about it very smart and incorporates really what people are feeling and how the general public sees these issues. So, I think in short, I think as we continue this conversation, and there's a lot that we can discuss around this issue, I think what I've learned so far is that we level set that there is a real intent, that this is a racist approach, and that not only is it a racist, but it's also classist, and that it particularly targets people who are poor and people who are brown and people who are Black. And in immigration policy, that has been historically the approach that we've seen in how immigration policies are implemented in this country, and in how immigrants are treated in trying to access a safety net program, trying to access public benefits, trying to access programs that they themselves are paying for through their own tax dollars. And we ourselves need to reclaim that as a right that we have in order to meet the needs of our families. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Adriana. And in the sake of time, I'm going to transition over to Iffy, and then we'll jump into our all panelist questions, and we're going to do a lightning round real quick, so we can get to some Q&A at the end, okay? So throughout this conversation, we've heard about the lived experiences behind narratives, the policy consequences, and the impact on communities. Iffy, I'd love to turn to you to help us understand the power of the narratives themselves. So your work sits at the intersection of policy, communications, culture, and community wisdom. You've spent your career helping people understand how narratives shape what is politically possible. So why do false narratives about public benefits have such staying power, and what can we do to build the power needed to reframe the narrative?
Just like everyone else, whoa, of a question. Um, I am going to try my best not to sprint through this response. I want to start by saying that sometimes what we fail to reiterate, even if we know it, is that the whole concept of the American dream is a lie. And for that narrative to work, you also have to adopt and understand the story of acquisition. Like, what does it take to acquire the American dream, right? And what we are seeing, and I'll get to this concept, I'll get back to this concept in a bit, around how shame, right? That narratives are not just about how we tell stories. Narratives are about how these stories inform us about ourselves, inform us about other people, and then create a pattern of behavior that in many ways we all adopt as this must be true, right? And so we still talk about the American dream. We still hear electeds talk about the American dream, but we don't have enough people questioning what is the route to get to the American dream? What is that route for the individual who is coming into this country and wants to also participate in it, right? And so I want to ground us in a little bit of understanding that for the American dream to work, you have to also believe and adhere in this bootstrap narrative, right? That you work hard and then you get the White House and the picket fence. But we don't talk about sometimes the sub messaging of what's also behind that design, which is a deterrent to holding government accountable, a deterrent to, in many ways, organizing, and a further deepening of individualism. And when you create fantasies around individual gain, then you decenter communities. The values and the healthiness of intercodependency and villages becomes to start seeing as part of the fraud, right? That you're trying to trick your way to the top. And then we constantly glamorize the grind, even though we know the grind is killing us, right? I'm from Trenton, but I like to remind people that I spent 6 years living in West Virginia. I was in Appalachia, and I'm gonna tell you right now, That there are certain forms of poverty that I had seen and witnessed in West Virginia that even as a girl who grew up in the hood poor, I wouldn't trade that type of poverty. But what I understood, and I stress this to say that I know it's about race, because there was also the sub-context messaging or attitudes that people felt like the only thing that they had, if we're going to be honest, above me is that they weren't Black, even though they knew economically we were either in shared spaces or economically there were even some differences in how they too were mistreated by the government, but they didn't want to push back against this American dream narrative that would then otherwise make them a little bit closer to some of us on this call, right? And so when you're talking about how do these narratives uphold, they are upheld by individuals that also have not been benefited by the government, but are participating in ways in the hope that they too will be in this very exclusive class of individuals that are able to move through and benefit not just from the privileges of these tax codes and all the different ways that corporations are benefiting, but they also benefit with the both and, right? They also need those who are poor and in somewhat privileged, not speaking up. Right. And I think it's really important that we keep that in mind, because the beauty of ancestors like Fred Hampton, what he was able to see was that if I can bring people together, regardless of class, to come and recognize that we are all being mistreated by this government, then that people power is actually going to beat those that are in the minority, right? And there's a reason why he's not here. And I want us to raise that because I don't want us to get in the cycle of we haven't tried. It is important that we highlight the individuals that have pushed back against the many ways that Adriana had raised that are intended to divide us, and to really think about what then is the baton pass that we need to be doing today beyond just relying on laws. Because as a lawyer, I'll tell you right now, it is not the laws that were saving our people. It was disruption. It was always disruption. But to disrupt means that you also have to push back against this narrative of what it means to be American and what it means to be a patriot and what it means to be even moving in democratic means. So while, yes, I am all for voting, I know that voting itself is not revolutionary. What would be revolutionary is if we all were able to vote without having a problem. That would be revolutionary, right? So voting is a necessity. But when we are talking about the policies and why this concept around fraud, the concept of fraud is a symptom of a larger narrative of keeping people on a straight and narrow of what it means to participate and what it means to be American, right? So that you yourself may have even gone through the various processes of what it means to be once quote unquote undocumented, and now you have your papers. But that also means that when you're seeing injustice happening to other communities, you are also in a position of questioning, how do I operate in this, right? Because you have now also been a part of this system. And this is not to put blame on communities. I am expressing, as you asked the question, Parker, sometimes it is really hard for us to sit with, why do these narratives continue? And what is my participation in the continuation of these narratives, right? But I also don't like to stop there. I want to share one thing very, very quickly before we get into like what we need to do. A lot of people have heard of TANF, right? Temporary assistance for needy families. A lot of people have not heard of its predecessor, which was the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC. And you really got to understand AFDC to understand why we even got to TANF. AFDC, created in the 1930s, it was designed with a specific purpose in mind to support white widows. They were seen as deserving. They were seen as blameless. It was not their fault that they were single parents running their homes. It was actually seen as a tragedy that they had to raise homes and raise children and figure out economically what they were going to do. So it was the program, policy program was a national program, and it was baked into the program that some women are falling on hard times due to no fault of their own. Then what happened? Black women started accessing the program, especially around the civil rights movement, right? And then something shifted, and it wasn't in the policy language, but the story behind who were now welfare recipients. Right? So now all of a sudden you have suitable home inspections, you have man in the house rules, you start having moral character investigations. I am naming these things because we don't often talk about how we get to the policies of food stamps that look like monopoly money, because that also wasn't by accident either. And I want us to think about the various ways that dehumanizing, especially femme folk of color, right? How that in many ways has created this ladder to what we are experiencing right now. Because even as we are talking about immigration, even as we're talking about public benefits, we don't often talk about the genderized ways that this puts especially femme folk at a disadvantage in a system that already did not see women, even white women, as citizens. And so I just want, I want, this is kind of like that part. I'm glad I started with Octavia Butler, because just because I talk about these things doesn't, and they're fact, I think by design, we are disincentivized to discuss the truth of how we got here and really understand that if we're going to do something different, that includes calling out how femfolk have been, how the patriarchal system still has us talking about utilizing democratic policies. But I want to highlight that these were individuals that were elected officials. These were people that have the pen. These were people that were able to create the policy. So some of the things that I think we need to start thinking about, first of all, is we need to stop playing defense on their terrain. Every time we argue about fraud rates and percentages, in many ways, we are accepting the frame as is. I believe the first question we need to start with isn't how much fraud is there, but it's really who gets treated like a suspect and who gets treated like a citizen. You explain to me, legislator, who is a human? Give me your definition of who is a human being. We don't ask that from our policymakers because we make the assumption that they know who a human being is. We need to start having more platforms that say, in our community, we're only going to elect people that see me as a human being. And we need to start normalizing that we cannot no longer have people that aren't able to identify that individuals, regardless of citizenship status, orientation, a disability, gender, et cetera, do have rights. I know it doesn't feel like it with the Supreme Court, but technically they do have rights under our Constitution, and that is important. Second, I do think we need to build narrative power the same way we build political power, which, as it was mentioned here, is from the grass, from what people would perceive as the bottom, which I think spiritually is the top, right? We know that lived experience is data. We know that community wisdom is evidence, but we need more people who have navigated these systems, telling their stories and normalizing that their voice should be at the front, not a sprinkle, not on the side, not on as an aftermath. I often say that data and research is only reinforcing the truth of what people have been saying from the beginning. And I say that as a researcher. I am not discovering anything. I'm not Columbusing anything. I am only creating spaces for what people have been saying from the beginning. And the final part I will say this is that there is an opportunity with narratives to reclaim dignity in a way that, even though I could focus on Trump, but I don't want to focus on Trump, more people are recognizing now more than ever that we all poor. And he coming for all of us. And there is something about that. I think we need to operate in ways to unshame what it means to be experiencing what we're experiencing at this point, right? Unshaming poverty. So yes, I'm an individual with 4 degrees, but I'm an individual with 4 degrees who is a proud recipient of Head Start. I'm a proud recipient of seeing my mama buy government cheese with things that look like could have won or not won in Monopoly. I had a full ride scholarship and I still needed loans to make sure I could get through school because there was no savings there for me to even get some food on the side when the cafeteria was closed from Monday through Friday at school. We need to normalize this because I do think that there is a wrongful narrative that people who are poor are stupid. People who are poor don't know how to make decisions, and also that people who are rich know more. So I think that our narrative games, as much as I would love for it to be about just about policies and laws, we simultaneously also need to be talking differently about who we are as people and our relationship with poverty, right? Something we did not create, but we did inherit. And we need to be doing more unifying strategies around how we debunk. When somebody's talking about my Latina sister, I'm debunking that. When somebody's talking about how Haitian community members are experiencing right now, TPS being taken away also by the Supreme Court today, we make sure that we raise that. We need to get back to the spirit of the Fred Hamptons of the world, of the Ella Bakers of the world, that if we're not all safe, if we're not all free, then none of us are free, right? And we need to be sharing that narrative with each other and sharing that language with each other.
Y'all, my feet getting light because y'all are preaching today. Okay. I love everything that's being said. I know we are very short on time, so I wanted to end with a final question. I'm going to kind of combine our last question. So first off, I know we have a lot of state administrators, legislators, et cetera, on the call who really want to understand how they need to be framing the message. So number one, how do you recommend we frame our messaging to state administrators, legislators, and everyday people around fraud? And then also to end with something more visionary. In one sentence, what is the narrative about public benefits and people experiencing poverty that you most want to build instead? So lightning really fast. We have 2 minutes. I'll start with Christina.
I knew you were going to start with me. So I'm going to go the other way around. So the one sentence, even though this was very, very, very hard, is that everyone deserves support to survive today and thrive tomorrow. I'm going to say it again. Everyone deserves support to survive today and thrive tomorrow. That is the one sentence that if I had to speak in front of a legislator today is the epitome of what I would want them to understand and to know. And I think that the other part of it is that as policymakers, lawmakers, change makers are walking into different rooms, it is critical and essential that we take a pause and stop talking about people without talking with people. I'm going to leave it at that because I know we got 2 minutes.
Okay, next I'll pass it on to Adriana.
Hi, yes, I'll do the same. I'll start with the big vision. I'll just share with you all our vision at the PIF Coalition, which is a caring society where every individual is valued for their humanity. Immigrants and their families thrive and are recognized as pillars of community strength, and everyone has access to life's essential. That is what we are fighting for. That is what we are working for, and that's what we would love to all of you join us in. And for policymakers and those in government, you all are leaders and champions and can be champions for family wellness and fairness in a very broken economy. So think about the communities that you represent. Think about the people who may not necessarily vote, but who depend on you so that their lives can thrive and that their children can have a better future. And we're here to support you too.
Yes, Dr. Mishner and then Iffy.
Okay, I'll be quick because I know we're out of time. In terms of big vision, I guess what I want to say about narrative is that we are not the only ones and not the central ones that should be doing the work of crafting the narratives. And so, how do we enable and create the kind of processes and institutions we need to identify narratives that people are already offering and already relying on to make sense of their own worlds, who are experiencing these programs, and who are currently at the kind of negative end of existing narratives. So I want to articulate a vision that involves the curation and articulation and cultivation of narratives happening from the proverbial sort of bottom or margins, right? As opposed to us thinking we can craft the perfect narrative that's going to be like helping all our comms, meeting all our comms needs, because I think that thinking has not worked for us. And then, in terms of one thing, I always go back to our basic shared humanity and our the inevitability of human need and human frailty. And that is just true. It's true for all of us. And so really thinking about and pushing others to think about and grapple with that. What does that mean for how we ought to be treating each other and sharing and distributing resources in our society? Ultimately, what it means is that tests of deservingness do not matter. They don't. And we have to really deeply and consistently reject any narrative that ultimately hinges on deservingness, and fraud narratives ultimately do hinge on that.
And very quickly, I do empathize as a former Hill staffer, as a former policy person in local government. Oftentimes, we folks who work behind the scenes are seen as like part of the problem or not necessarily innovative enough. If there are folks that are working in local and national government, I really, really hope that what you take from this is what everyone I think is aligned on, which is how do you create more, how do you use the resources that exist and or hack ways to get more community voices to be leading the narrative that informs the policies, to disrupt the policies that are not helping our people. Specifically to legislators, I do want to say this. When you build policy on suspicion, you're not reducing fraud. What you're reducing is access, right? You make the paperwork harder. You create more systems to surveil. You create more humiliating experiences, right? So I want folks to recognize that when you do that, don't be surprised when people don't want to engage with you. So I do think that we need to have some truth telling with our legislators, with our state administrators, that you may be thinking you're doing the right thing, but what you're actually doing, which is connected to what our dear doctor had raised, what you're actually doing is you're disincentivizing individuals from participating in democracy, right? Because the space that they're supposed to trust has now becoming distrusting of them. And the one sentence that I wrote out so that I wouldn't spend too much time on here is that public benefits are not a handout to the undeserving. They are the infrastructure of a society that has decided no one's dignity is negotiable. And we have to get back to that. None of us are negotiable. None of us are part human. We are all human. Human beings deserve to thrive, and we need to create systems where that is the norm and not an exception.
Wow. Thank you all so much for joining us. To our esteemed panelists, you all have been amazing. And I've told y'all need to take this show on the road. Okay. This was great. So for everyone else who has joined us, please, we have a short exit survey that will populate as soon as you close out of the webinar. So we love for you to fill that out to understand what your takeaways were and how we can cater programming in the future. So thank you for joining this month's Equity Matters. Thank you.